We are joined on the line now from Geneva by Brian Pearce. He's Chief Economist at the International Air Transport Association to discuss the state of the airline industry globally with us right now. Thanks so much, Brian, for joining us today. We've seen the International Air Transport Association raising its 2011 forecast for global airline profits by 73%. And it seems that some surprise has come through from both the European and Middle Eastern territories. And it's surprising that you're seeing increased demand from Europe. Run us through some of the driving factors at play there.
Well, I think it really reflects the performance that we've seen in the first half. The forward-looking indicators for the rest of this year and into 2012, look rather gloomy, as is the rest of the economic news. And I think the European airlines have done well, not so much because of the strength of their home markets, but because of their success on international markets. Europe, which is obviously a key source of tourists for South Africa and the rest of Africa, is nonetheless still looking pretty weak.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we've got some of those profits being raked in by carriers, we've been hearing that margins are coming under severe pressure. Of course, that with rising cost pressures and the inability of these carriers to pass on those costs to consumers at this stage of the game. Just how much under pressure have those margins come?
Well, I think the first thing to realise is that profit margins for airlines worldwide are extremely low when you compare them to other industries. So it's always a very difficult industry in which to make money. And passengers will have noticed this by the fact that prices have fallen very substantially over the last few years. And the rise in fuel costs, because although everyone's getting very gloomy about the economic outlook, the price of kerosene and the price of oil is still very high. Kerosene is still 40% above where it was at this time last year. And with softening markets, it's very difficult for airlines to pass those costs on, so margins are getting squeezed.
Yeah, one would assume that this ignites somewhat of a shift in trend when it comes to, measures that are being employed by airlines to mitigate these kind of cost pressures. What are we seeing on that front?
Well, you're seeing airlines where they can afford it renew their fleet with the latest aircraft, which often offer 15 or 20% fuel efficiencies, and those tend to be passed through to passengers in lower fares. And the International Air Transport Association is working very hard to remove some of the inefficiencies that we're seeing in the airspace, to shorten the routes out, to speed up transit times for passengers, and to cut costs.
Well, what's your view on the kind of support that this industry needs to, further growth moving forward? Because we've had a stimulus and the call for stimulus being bandied about in some quarters. Certainly in South Africa, there's much furore around the airport taxes and other taxes that are rising so fast. What do you think the sector needs in terms of stimulus, if any?
Well, I think one important point is that air transport is a very important catalyst for economic growth, both through the tourists it carries, but also the trade, connecting African businesses to markets around the world. I think it's a key sector for supporting economic expansion. And we've seen recently that the airports in South Africa are being permitted a 161% rise in charges. This is going to make Johannesburg the most expensive airport to land at in the world, which is not the way to attract tourism and trade.
Mm-hmm. We're so focused on tourism for this conversation, but let's perhaps shift some of that attention to trade and look at passenger versus freight growth. What are we looking on the freight side of things?
Well, world trade and air freight has been rather disappointing, and we've seen air freight generally actually hasn't grown in the last 2 years. But interestingly, there are some trade routes with Africa that are showing some strength that's not being seen elsewhere. The Africa to Far East market has grown by almost 2% in the year to date, and Africa to Middle East has grown by almost 4%. It does look as if we're seeing some new trade links being developed to the benefit of the economy.
Is that pretty much what's behind the kind of revision we've seen for your African carriers in terms of what they're likely to do in terms of performance this year? Because we saw IATA saying that African carriers will likely break even this year, and that a revision on an earlier forecast for a $100 million loss.
Yes, I think it's a combination of, what we've seen actually, within Africa, air travel is growing by 10%. Traffic between Africa and the Far East is growing at a similar rate. There's a lot of business travel connected with these trade links, which is very encouraging, I think, for the future. And we've also seen better performance by local airlines. South African Airways, recently announced some very good results for the year to the end of March. So, the performance of the airlines, as well as slightly stronger markets in comparison with the rest of the world, has helped performance.
Well, Brian, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Brian Pearce is Chief Economist at the International Air Transport Association, and he was discussing the state of the global airline industry with us.